Headlines across North America paint a startling picture. Canadian travelers, once Florida's lifeblood, are vanishing. Statistics: Canada reports nearly a 19% year-over-year plunge in air returns from the US, while Forbes highlights a summer drop in border crossings exceeding 35%. At Tampa Bay's Johns Pass, store owners describe a ghost town, their revenues down by almost a third. The shock isn't just economic, it's political. If Canadians are boycotting Florida vacations, what does that mean for America's most tourism-dependent state? For decades, Florida symbolized the dream getaway for millions of Canadians. Snowbirds flocked south each winter, filling beaches, boardwalks, and condos along the Gulf Coast. By 2024, Florida welcomed a record 143 million visitors, including more than 3.4 million Canadians, its largest international market. The steady stream of travelers represented not just vacations, but deep cultural ties. Restaurants, real estate, and small businesses across Tampa Bay and Fort Lauderdale thrived on the predictability of Canadian tourism. It was a golden era of stability, where sunshine and open roads promised familiar comfort year after year. But beneath the postcard image, fault lines began to emerge. Hurricane Helene ripped across Pinellas County in late 2024, damaging critical stretches like Johns Pass and delaying recovery well into the following summer. At the same time, US politics turned confrontational. Reciprocal tariffs imposed in 2025 fueled uncertainty, while rhetoric from Washington left many Canadians feeling unwelcome. Statistics Canada recorded an 18.9% drop in April returns from the US, and July crossings by car fell nearly 37% year over year. For the first time in decades, Canadians began shifting away from Florida, seeking alternative destinations overseas. The dependable bond was quietly fraying. In Washington, the decision to impose reciprocal tariffs was framed as a matter of national pride. The White House announced on April 2, 2025, that under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, tariffs would be raised to match those of trading partners. The stated goal was to defend American industry from unfair practices abroad. By July, adjustments pushed key duties to as high as 25%, before settling at 15% for some allies after bruising negotiations. To the administration, this was proof that the United States would no longer be taken for granted. Yet for tourism, the impact was swift and severe. Policies meant to target goods and trade flows bled into perceptions of the U.S. as a destination. Canadians, who had long felt welcome in Florida's resorts and retirement communities, began to interpret tariffs and political rhetoric as hostility. Forbes reported that 60% of Canadian adults said recent U.S. trade policies made them less likely to visit. Bloomberg put the figure at 55% avoiding or cutting back spending on American vacations. The numbers told the story. In April 2025, Statistics Canada recorded an 18.9% drop in air returns from the U.S. compared to the prior year. By July, car crossings back from Florida and other states had collapsed by nearly 37% year over year. Airlines cut capacity. Cirium data showed carriers slashing between 4.4 and 6.1% of US-bound seats in the second quarter. OAG noted that Canadian bookings to the US for the high summer season fell almost 70%. At Johns Pass Boardwalk, business owners described a ghost town. Shops that once thrived on Canadian families saw revenues fall by 30% during spring and summer. A Tampa Bay tourism executive put it bluntly: "It doesn't matter what Washington's intention was. Perception is reality, and the reality is Canadians feel punished." The U.S. sought leverage on tariffs. Instead, it triggered a boycott in tourism, one of Florida's most vital arteries. Canada's reaction was shaped not only by policy, but by emotion. For decades, Florida vacations were part of Canadian identity. Retirees spending winters in Clearwater, families escaping cold Decembers in Fort Lauderdale, students flying south for spring break. But when tariffs spiked and political rhetoric from U.S. leaders sharpened, Canadians felt targeted. What once felt like a friendly corridor now seemed like a border of resentment. Statistics: Canada data revealed the pivot clearly. Overseas travel rose sharply, climbing from 26.9% to 36.1% of Canadian outbound trips. Mexico, the Caribbean, and Europe became the new winners. In the first 6 months of 2025, travel to the US fell about 24%, while long-haul bookings surged. Airlines and tour operators followed the money. Canadian carriers boosted routes to Cancun, Lisbon, and Athens while trimming US capacity. In public surveys, Canadians articulated their choices not just as economic, but as political. A majority cited unfriendly trade policies and negative messaging as reasons for avoiding US destinations. On social media, the phrase "boycott Florida" trended repeatedly, amplified by stories of families canceling trips and opting for all-inclusive Caribbean packages instead. Axios and PBS reported sharp drops in bookings specifically to Florida, with Fort Lauderdale among the hardest hit. Canadian media framed the shift as both protest and self-protection. If US policy introduced volatility, why risk hard-earned vacation dollars there? Instead, families chose places where they felt welcome and where costs were more predictable. The ripple effect touched even traditional snowbird retirees. Some began experimenting with winters in Portugal or Mexico, destinations offering warm climates without political baggage. For Ottawa, the boycott carried diplomatic undertones. Canadian officials did not officially endorse the movement, but neither did they discourage it. The underlying message was clear. If America weaponized tariffs, Canada would redirect not only its trade, but its people. Vacations, once symbols of continental closeness, had become bargaining chips in a larger game. By mid-2025, the confrontation had calcified into stalemate. The United States insisted its tariffs were necessary to protect sovereignty, while Canada's travelers voted with their feet, abandoning Florida's beaches in record numbers. Both sides faced dilemmas with no easy resolution. Washington could not easily roll back tariffs without appearing weak, and Tallahassee had little power to influence federal trade decisions. Meanwhile, Canadian officials balanced quiet satisfaction at newfound leverage with concern over alienating their largest neighbor. On the ground, businesses in Florida faced a summer of losses, while Canadian airlines and overseas resorts profited. Yet neither side could claim victory. The US had gained tariffs, but lost billions in tourism. Canada had made a point, but risked permanently fraying a cross-border tradition that once bound the continent together. The fracture was not just economic, but cultural. For the first time in decades, North America's easy rhythm of travel and trust had been disrupted, and no one knew how or when it could be restored. At first glance, Canadians appeared to hold the upper hand. Families redirected their vacations to Europe, Mexico, and the Caribbean, and airlines quickly reprogrammed routes to meet that demand. But beneath the celebratory tone of New Horizons, costs mounted at home. Tour operators in Ontario and Quebec, who specialized in US destinations, were left scrambling. One Toronto-based agency reported a 45% plunge in bookings tied to Florida packages, forcing layoffs of veteran staff. Canadian snowbirds also discovered that alternatives were not always cheaper. A retired couple from Alberta noted that extended stays in Portugal cost nearly 20% more than their usual Florida condo rental. Insurance premiums, long-haul airfare, and the weaker Canadian dollar compounded expenses. For middle-class households, the boycott came with trade-offs. Vacations required longer flights, higher budgets, and more complex logistics. Canada had proven it could flex its consumer power, but doing so exposed its own travelers to higher costs and instability, reminders that even symbolic boycotts carry tangible sacrifices. In Florida, the losses were immediate and painful. At Johns Pass Boardwalk in Madeira Beach, local shop owners reported revenues plunging by roughly 30% during spring and summer. Career source Northeast Florida warned that every 10% decline in Canadian visitation risked erasing 14,000 American jobs nationwide. Axios estimated that a 20 to 25% pullback could burn through $4 to $5 billion in annual spending. For small family-run restaurants and souvenir stores, these were not abstract numbers, but empty tables and unpaid bills. The ripple spread to airlines and hospitality chains. Cirium data showed carriers trimming U.S.-bound capacity by up to 6%, raising ticket prices for American travelers as well. Resorts dependent on international guests slashed staff hours. Even grocery stores and gas stations in tourist-heavy counties felt the pinch. Meanwhile, Washington's tariff architects insisted the policy was working. But for business owners staring at deserted boardwalks, the rhetoric felt hollow. The U.S. had secured leverage in trade negotiations, but at the expense of one of its most reliable revenue streams, Canadian tourism. North America now faces a crossroads. The United States defends its tariffs as necessary leverage, even as Florida's businesses bleed revenue. Canada's travelers have discovered alternatives, but at higher costs and greater distances. Both nations stand locked in a cycle where politics reshapes vacations and vacations reshape politics. In the race to define the future, will North America win together or fail apart by going it alone? You're American or Canadian? Share below.